What's up again, everybody? I'm Clayton. Welcome back to Ages of Film. Today, I'm going to be doing a big time ranking video. We're ranking all of the Universal Classic monster films. I put a poll up on my channel if this was something you guys wanted me to do. Overwhelming majority voted yes. I think it's like 95% of you voted yes to do this. That's what we're doing. I had to take some time to kind of. I've been going through all these movies the past couple months, finished up, but this is a long ranking video, so it took some time to record, edit, and release this for you freaks. So but here it is. So there are 25 films altogether that we're going to be ranking. For anyone that's not as familiar with the Universal Classic horror franchises, there are basically 6 franchises that we're going to be pulling from and ranking. We have Dracula, Frankenstein, the Wolfman. Those are kind of the big 3. And then you have the Mummy, the Creature from the Black Lagoon, and the Invisible Man. So 6 franchises total. We also are going to be including Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, because that is technically considered part of the Universal Monster tie-in, even though it's also it's part of the Abbott and Costello movie franchise. There was a bit of a crossover there, and Universal does actually recognize it and include it in their Universal Monster ranking. So we are going to be including Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, giving us 25 films total. We're just gonna go worst to the best. I'm gonna keep these more in like a summary type of format. I'm not gonna go in like specific details. This isn't a review. I'm not reviewing these movies. I'm ranking them. So I want to be somewhat brief, not spend too much time on any one movie, but also kind of give each film its due time in the sun, if you will, and talk about each one, what I like about it, what I don't like about it. You'll see my score, my ranking, my rating of the film on the screen as we go by, but this is basically just gonna be summary format of my overall collective thoughts on each of these films, and you'll kind of get an idea of my criteria and how I come to my scores and my ranking on these as we go along. So that out of the way. Oh, and one other thing I do want to just mention, I'm going to keep these all, also try to keep them somewhat spoiler free, considering that they've all been out for a long ass time. All right. So if you haven't seen these movies, that's on you. That's not on me if something gets spoiled in these, but I try to always respect the fact that, someone may be coming to a movie for the first time and genuinely be curious about it and not want things spoiled. So these will be kind of spoiler-free summaries of my overall thoughts of each of these films. That out of the way, let's get rocking, because it's going to be a long video. Grab a snack, grab a drink, kick back, and let's kick it. The Mummy's Curse represents the complete collapse of the Kara series as both horror and storytelling. By this point, the mythology is so inconsistent and stripped of meaning that the film barely feels connected to what came before it. Moving the story to a Louisiana bayou further removes any remaining sense of identity or atmosphere tied to its Egyptian roots. The plot follows the rediscovery of Karis and the revival of Princess Inaka, but it unfolds with little tension or coherence. The film feels rushed and mechanical, cycling through familiar beats without building dread or stakes. There's no real escalation, just events happening without impact. Karis is at his weakest here, reduced to a repetitive, almost lifeless presence with no mystique or threat. Even Inaka's return, which should carry emotional or narrative weight, is handled so abruptly that it barely registers. Ultimately, the film feels empty. It abandons what once made the mummy a compelling character and replaces it with a hollow, formulaic shell, ending the series and arguably Universal's classic monster cycle on its lowest note. Revenge of the Creature takes the strong atmospheric foundation of Creature from the Black Lagoon and trains it for a safer, more conventional, romantic sequel. By bringing the Gillman into civilization and placing him in captivity, the film removes the mystery and isolation that made the original so effective. The premise, capturing and studying the creature in a Florida oceanarium, has real thematic potential, especially around exploitation and control, but the film never fully explores these ideas, instead settling into a predictable capture, study, escape structure with limited tension or escalation. Furthermore, the two romantic leads in the film do not project any kind of energy or character depth in their performance or chemistry together to make me invest or care about their relationship. The underwater sequences do still carry some visual strength, but much of the film feels flatter and less immersive. Most importantly, the creature himself is diminished. He no longer feels like a territorial force of nature, but rather a contained specimen, lacking the presence and mystique that defined him before. Ultimately, the film doesn't build on the original, it confines it. What was once eerie and symbolic becomes routine, turning a uniquely compelling monster into something far more ordinary. The Mummy's Hand marks a fundamental shift in Universal's mummy mythology, moving away from the eerie, tragic mysticism of the mummy and into something far more diluted, formulaic, and tonally inconsistent. Instead of Imhotep's quiet menace and psychological dread, we're introduced to Karis, a more physical force than Imhotep, but far less compelling monster, wrapped in a story that often feels more like a light adventure serial than a horror film. The film follows a pair of bumbling American adventurers who stumble upon a legend of a buried Egyptian princess and the cursed mummy who guards her tomb. What unfolds is a less descent into ancient terror and more a loosely structured expedition film with comedic side characters, predictable plotting, and a noticeable lack of genuine suspense. The horror is constantly undercut by humor that doesn't just relieve tension, it replaces it entirely. Karis himself, while visually striking and physically imposing, is reduced to a tool rather than a presence. He lacks the intelligence, mystique, and tragic dimension that made Karloff's Imhotep more emotionally engaging. Instead of a character, he's essentially a walking commanding tool, summoned, directed, and disposed of without ever feeling like a true force of horror. Tonally, the film struggles to decide what it wants to be. It leans heavily into comedy and pulp adventure, which might work on its own terms, but as a follow up to an established horror film, it feels disconnected from the genre it was rooted in. The sense of dread and minimal stakes feel low, and the narrative rarely builds toward anything resembling real fear. Ultimately, The Mummy's Hand establishes Kars's template that would go on to define the future sequels, but it does so at the cost of any emotional core or horror innovation. Ghost of Frankenstein represents a significant decline in both narrative integrity and thematic coherence within the series. What was once a character driven exploration of creation and consequences becomes here a fragmented and increasingly mechanical continuation. Tonally, the film struggles to establish a clear identity. While it does not descend into outright contradiction, it lacks the focused atmosphere that defined earlier entries. The sense of gothic dread is diminished, replaced by a more procedural and disjointed progression of events. Narratively, the film introduces the concept of brain transference as a central device. And while this could have served as a compelling extension of the series' themes, being identity, consciousness, the nature of the self, etc., it's handled in a superficial and inconsistent manner. The implications are not explored. They are merely utilized to advance the plot. From a genre perspective, the film's horror elements feel diluted. The monster, once a figure of tragedy and pathos, becomes increasingly reduced to a functional component of the narrative rather than its emotional core. Viewer engagement is further hindered by the film's lack of narrative cohesion. Events unfold without a strong sense of progression, and the pacing feels uneven. Emotionally, the film is largely ineffective. The central character, the monster, loses the sympathetic dimension that once defined him, resulting in a story that lacks both weight and resonance. The Mummy is often held in high regard for its atmosphere, and to its credit, it does establish a distinct tonal identity early on. The film opens with a sense of ancient dread and quiet reverence, and Boris Karloff does deliver a controlled, calculated, and understated performance that lends the character a certain gravitas. However, as the film progresses, that atmosphere becomes its primary and almost soul-defining strength. The pacing is exceedingly deliberate to the point where it begins to undermine engagement. Scenes linger without sufficient narrative propulsion, and the tension dissipates rather than escalates. Narratively, the film introduces ideas of reincarnation and external longing, which carry inherent thematic weight, but yet these identities are not explored with the depth or clarity necessary to create meaningful resonance. They exist more as conceptual framing than as fully realized themes. From a genre standpoint, the film leans heavily into mood over function. There is very little sustained horror, and the sense of threat diminishes quickly once the premise is established, leaving long stretches where the film feels inert. The rewatchability is significantly impacted by this imbalance. While the opening retains its effectiveness, the remainder of the film struggles to maintain momentum or viewer engagement. Emotionally, the film feels very mundane and boring. The central relationship lacks urgency, and the narrative does not build toward a particularly impactful conclusion, but ends rather abruptly. Dracula's Daughter is a film with considerable thematic ambition, particularly in its exploration of compulsion, identity, and repression. It attempts to move beyond the archetypal villainy of Dracula and into something more psychologically nuanced. Tonally, the film is restrained and deliberate. It maintains a subdued, almost melancholic atmosphere. However, that restraint also contributes to a lack of urgency. The film feels distant rather than immersive. Narratively, there are genuinely compelling ideas at play here. The notion of vampirism as a burden, something to be resisted rather than embraced, adds a layer of complexity. There are also subtextual elements that suggest deeper psychological conflict. Yet, these ideas are never fully realized. The film introduces them, but does not develop them with sufficient clarity or commitment. As a result, the thematic weight feels more implied rather than expressed. In terms of genre achievement, the film leans more toward psychological drama than horror. There are moments of tension, but they are sporadic rather than sustained. Engagement becomes a challenge, the pacing is slow, and the narrative lacks a strong driving force. While the film is intellectually interesting, it is not consistently compelling. Emotionally, it remains somewhat detached. The central character struggle is present, but not fully conveyed in a way that creates strong audience connection. The Invisible Woman marks a definitive pivot away from horror and into light comedy. It does so with clear sense of intent. The tone is consistent, bright, coy, and unburdened by tension. There's no ambiguity about what the film aims to be. However, within the framework of how I evaluate these films, that shift creates a fundamental disconnect. While the film may succeed on its own terms as a modest comedy, it does not fulfill the expectations of the genre it originates from. Narratively, the film is relatively slight. The concept of invisibility is no longer treated as a source of psychological deterioration or existential isolation, but rather as a vehicle for situational humor. As a result, thematic depth is minimal. In terms of engagement, the pacing is serviceable and the film maintains a degree of charm, but that engagement is surface level. There is little narrative tension or progression to sustain deeper investment. Emotionally, the film operates within a narrow range. It does not, it is not designed to evoke fear, tragedy, or even significant empathy. It entertains, but it does not resonate. House of Dracula is built on an intriguing premise: the idea of monsters seeking liberation from their own afflictions. On paper, this introduces a layer of introspection that could deepen the narrative. In practice, however, the film struggles to synthesize its ideas into a cohesive whole. Tonally, the film is somewhat diffuse. It does not collapse into contradiction, but it lacks a singular defining atmosphere. Instead, it moves between threads, Dracula, the Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster without seeking or establishing a unifying emotional or stylistic identity. Narratively, the concept of curing monstrosity carries significant thematic potential. It suggests internal conflict, identity crisis, and even redemption. Yet, the film does not fully commit to exploring these ideas. They are introduced, but not integrated with sufficient depth or continuity. From a genre perspective, the horror elements are present, but diluted. The monsters no longer command the same sense of dread or authority here. Their roles feel diminished, almost procedural. Engagement becomes fragmented. The film structure disperses focus rather than building momentum. As a result, the pacing feels uneven, not slow, but unfocused. Emotionally, the film remains largely inert. The premise invites introspection, but the execution never generates meaningful weight. The Creature Walks Among Us represents a tonal and conceptual departure from its predecessors, shifting away from primal horror into something more contemplative and subdued. The film adopts a restrained, almost clinical tone, emphasizing observation over tension. To its credit, this tonal direction is internally consistent. It doesn't fracture or oscillate. It simply redefines the experience. However, that redefinition comes at a cost. The sense of danger and immediacy that defined the original Creature movie is largely absent. Narratively, the film attempts to explore themes of domination, transformation, and the imposition of human will upon nature. There is an undercurrent of psychological inquiry here, particularly regarding identity and autonomy, and yet these ideas are only partially realized. The execution lacks the narrative urgency needed to fully articulate those themes. In terms of genre achievement, the film falters. It no longer functions effectively as horror, and its dramatic ambitions are not sufficiently developed to compensate. The result is a film that exists as a kind of liminal space, neither fully suspenseful nor fully introspective. Engagement suffers as a result. The pacing is measured, but the stakes feel distant. The creature itself, once a symbol of raw, elemental danger, becomes more passive and almost incidental. By the time The Mummy's Ghost arrives, the series has settled into a kind of cyclical repetition, yet this entry still manages to retain a baseline level of atmospheric coherence. The tone is unwaveringly somber, maintaining the slow, methodical dread that defines the Karis-centered films. There's no tonal dissonance here. The film understands its lane and remains within it. However, that same consistency becomes a limitation. The narrative feels like a progression and more feels less like a progression, I should say, and more like reiteration. While the reincarnation motif is present and conceptually compelling, it is not meaningfully expanded. Instead, it functions more as a structural device than a thematic exploration. The film gestures toward ideas of fate and spiritual inevitability, but never fully interrogates them. From a genre standpoint, it still operates as a functional horror film. Karis retains a physical presence, and there are moments of quiet menace, but the predictability of the structure diminishes suspense. The audience begins to anticipate each beat long before it arrives. Engagement, therefore, becomes uneven. The pacing is deliberate, but not always purposeful. And in terms of emotional impact, the film struggles to create resonance. The characters lack dimensionality, and the narrative does not build toward a particularly affecting culmination. House of Frankenstein operates primarily as a spectacle-driven crossover, assembling multiple iconic monsters into a single narrative. While this concept immediately creates a sense of novelty and anticipation, the film ultimately struggles to translate that potential into a cohesive or emotionally engaging story. The structure is fragmented, moving rapidly between characters and scenarios without allowing any single thread to develop meaningfully. This results in a lack of narrative focus, with characters introduced and discarded before they can leave a lasting impression. There's no central emotional spine anchoring the film, which makes it difficult to form any real investment in the outcome. That said, the film does possess several strengths that help sustain engagement. The pacing is relatively brisk, and it's consistently introduces new developments, preventing the experience from becoming stagnant. Visually, the film benefits from strong Gothic production design and atmospheric lighting, particularly in laboratory and nighttime sequences, which help maintain a recognizable horror aesthetic. The presence of multiple monsters also creates intermittent moments of intrigue, especially when the Wolfman is given space to operate within the story. There's also a degree of thematic potential in the idea of manipulation and control, particularly through the mad scientist figure played by Boris Karloff, though this is never fully explored or developed. Ultimately, the film remains mildly entertaining due to its momentum and visual atmosphere, but it lacks a cohesive character investment and meaningful payoff, prevents it from achieving anything beyond surface level engagement, limiting both its impact and long-term rewatch value. Invisible Agent represents a clear departure from the horror roots of the series, repositioning the concept of invisibility within a wartime espionage framework. As an adventure horror film, it is reasonably effective, with a steady pace and a series of action-driven sequences that maintain a surface-level engagement. The use of invisibility in espionage scenarios is creative and provides a functional foundation for the narrative. However, the shift in genre significantly weakens its alignment with horror. The tension is largely replaced by action and intrigue, and the film lacks the sense of dread or danger that defines stronger entries in the Universal lineup. While it remains watchable and occasionally entertaining, it does not offer the emotional weight, thematic depth, or tonal consistency associated with higher ranked films. Its identity feels diluted as a result. It ultimately functions as a diversion rather than a compelling genre piece, which limits both its impact and its rewatch value. Son of Dracula distinguishes itself through its southern Gothic setting, which introduces a fresh visual and atmospheric identity to the Dracula lineage. The fog-laden swamps and isolated mansions create a distinct mood that separates it from the more traditional European settings of earlier entries. The film also explores themes of control, immortality, and ambition, particularly through its central female character, giving the narrative a conceptual layer that adds intrigue. There is a sense of intention behind these ideas, suggesting a more ambitious approach to the material. However, the execution does not fully support the ambition. The pacing is uneven, and the film struggles to build sustained tension, often feeling subdued when it should be intensifying. The threat never fully materializes into something consistently compelling. Ultimately, it is a moderately engaging film with interesting ideas, but one that falls short of delivering a fully satisfying or impactful horror experience. The Invisible Man Returns benefits from a clearly defined narrative objective, centering on a man attempting to prove his innocence while navigating the dangers of invisibility. The structure provides a steady sense of direction, allowing the film to maintain engagement without drifting into narrative stagnation. Vincent Price brings a composed and authoritative presence through his voice acting, helping to ground the film and give the central conflict credibility. The pacing is measured and generally effective, with the story unfolding in a logical and coherent manner. The use of invisibility leans more towards suspense than spectacle, which helps maintain the consistent tone throughout. Despite this, the film lacks a defining edge. It does not possess the intensity, unpredictability, or thematic weight of stronger entries, and its more restrained approach limits its memorability. There are a few standout moments that leave any kind of lasting impression. As a result, it functions as a competent and structurally sound sequel, but one that remains modest in impact, settling comfortably into the upper middle tier on this list. The Mummy's Tomb stands as the most effective entry with the Karis series because it finally presents the mummy as a direct and persistent threat rather than a distant or passive presence. The film adopts a darker tone and places greater emphasis on physical danger, with which strengthens its identity as a horror piece and improves moment-to-moment engagement. The attacks feel more immediate, and the mummy's presence carries a stronger sense of inevitability. The narrative is relatively straightforward, which works in its favor, allowing the film to move with clarity and purpose. It avoids excessive digression and maintains a consistent sense of progression, making it easier to stay invested compared to weaker entries in the series. At the same time, the film remains limited by its reliance on established formula. Reused footage and familiar plot beats reduce its originality, and the characters are not developed enough to create deeper emotional investment. Even with those constraints, it succeeds as a functional and engaging horror film, delivering enough tension and consistency to stand above the rest of the Mummy films. The Invisible Man's Revenge is a solid and functional entry that works because it maintains a clear sense of conflict and forward momentum throughout its runtime. The narrative is straightforward, centered on revenge and self interest, which gives the story a direct and easy to follow structure that keeps the viewer engaged. The film avoids many of the pitfalls seen in weaker entries by staying focused. There's always a sense that the story is moving forward, and invisibility is used as a tool for active conflict rather than just passive spectacle. This helps maintain tension and gives the film a consistent level of engagement. However, it lacks standout elements that would elevate it further up this list. The performances are competent, but not particularly memorable, and the film doesn't introduce new ideas or emotional depth beyond its basic premise. Compared to Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, it doesn't have the same emotional weight or character driven investment. Still, it succeeds as a reliably watchable and cohesive genre film, making it stronger than other entries, even if it doesn't reach the same level of impact or innovative execution as other films. Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman works especially well because it builds directly off of the emotional foundation of the Wolfman, continuing Larry Talbot's tragic arc in a way that keeps the character grounded and engaging. His motivation is clear and compelling. He simply wants to die and be free of his curse, and that gives the film a strong emotional spine that carries across the narrative. The film is also highly entertaining and rewatchable, with a steady pace and a sense of momentum that keeps it from ever feeling stagnant. The crossover concept adds novelty and excitement, and the atmosphere, particularly in the opening and transformation sequences, is effective in maintaining a horror tone. However, the film doesn't fully capitalize on its premise. The Frankenstein monster is underdeveloped and inconsistently portrayed, which weakens the central conflict, and the climactic confrontation feels rushed relative to its buildup. Even with those issues, the film succeeds because it remains engaging, emotionally anchored through Talbot, and consistently entertaining, making it a stronger and more rewatchable entry than others on this list. Creature from the Black Lagoon is one of the most visually distinctive entries in the Universal lineup, and its effectiveness comes largely from how tangible and present the threat feels. The Gillman is one of the most convincing monster designs on this list, and the film uses him consistently as an active force rather than a distant or symbolic presence. The underwater cinematography is a major strength, adding a layer of immersion and tension that sets the film apart from the others. These sequences give the creature a sense of constant proximity, making it feel like a real danger rather than an occasional appearance. The pacing is steady, and the film maintains engagement by regularly returning to this central threat. However, the characters are relatively thin and the emotional investment is limited. The film doesn't aim for the same level of thematic depth or character driven storytelling as some of the higher entries, which can make it feel more straightforward. Even so, it succeeds where it matters most, that being genre intent. As a horror film, it maintains tension and remains engaging and thrilling throughout. Its simplicity actually works in its favor, making it a reliable and rewatchable entry. Son of Frankenstein earns its place in the top 10 largely due to its strong performance and consistent sense of threat, particularly through Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Igor. Igor is one of the most memorable supporting characters in the entire Universal lineup, bringing a sense of manipulation and unpredictability that keeps the film engaging. His presence adds tension and gives the story a clear antagonist driving the conflict. Visually, the film leans heavily into expressionist design with exaggerated sets and dramatic lighting that create a strong atmosphere. The stylization helps maintain the horror tone, even if it occasionally feels more theatrical than natural. The film also benefits from a more defined sense of stakes compared to weaker entries, keeping the narrative from becoming passive. However, the pacing can feel deliberate, and the theatrical presentation can create some emotional distance from the characters. While it maintains engagement through conflict and performance, it doesn't achieve the same level of emotional cohesion or investment as either of its predecessors. Even with those limitations, Son of Frankenstein succeeds because it remains active, engaging, and focused on its central conflict, making it a solid and effective continuation of the Frankenstein series. Dracula remains one of the most iconic horror films ever made, largely due to Bela Lugosi's legendary performance, which defines the character and gives the film its lasting presence. In the opening act, particularly in the Transylvania sequences, the film creates a strong gothic atmosphere using silence, shadow, and stillness to build a sense of unease and dread. Lugosi's controlled delivery and physical presence make Dracula feel imposing without relying on overt action to do so. However, the film struggles to maintain that level of engagement as it progresses. Once the story shifts to England, it becomes more dialogue heavy and visually static, with long stretches that feel more like a stage play than a cinematic experience. This leads to a noticeable drop in pacing and tension, which weakens the overall impact. Despite this, the film's influence and iconic moments and quotable dialogue cannot be overlooked. It establishes many of the visual and thematic elements that would define vampire cinema for decades. Ultimately, Dracula succeeds in parts rather than as a fully cohesive whole. Its highs are extremely strong, but its inconsistency maintaining engagement prevents it from reaching higher films on this list. The Invisible Man stands out in the Universal lineup because of its energy, creativity, and constant sense of forward momentum. Unlike many of the other films that rely heavily on atmosphere or slow building dread, this one is driven by chaos and escalation. Claude Rains' performance, entirely conveyed through his voice for most of the film, is a major strength, as he brings intensity, unpredictability, and a sense of unraveling madness that keeps the character compelling throughout. The pacing is one of the film's strongest qualities. There's very little downtime, and the narrative continually pushes forward as the character becomes more unstable and dangerous. The visual effects are also groundbreaking for the time and still hold up well enough to maintain immersion, adding to the film's sense of spectacle and unpredictability. However, the film's tone leans heavily into dark humor and manic energy, which can undercut sustained horror tension. It doesn't aim for emotional depth or tragedy in the same way as Wolfman or Frankenstein, and as a result, it can feel less impactful on a thematic level. Still, as a piece of entertainment and as a fast-moving genre film, it succeeds very well. Its rewatchability is high because of its pacing, creativity, and central lead performance, even if it doesn't reach the same emotional or thematic depth as some of the films above it. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein works exceptionally well because it fully understands its identity as a horror comedy and executes that balance with precision. The film never loses sight of its goal to entertain while still incorporating genuine elements of suspense, particularly through the use of the Wolfman and moments where the monsters are played straight against the comedic leads. Abbott and Costello bring strong comedic timing and chemistry, and their performances keep the film engaging throughout. What makes the film stand out is how well it integrates the monsters into the story without undermining them. Dracula, the Wolfman, and Frankenstein's monster are all treated with a level of seriousness that allows the horror elements to still function even within a comedic framework. The monsters are never the joke. The pacing is one of its biggest strengths. There's barely little downtime, and the film moves quickly from one set piece to the next, maintaining engagement and rewatchability. The score also plays an important role in supporting both the humor and the tension, helping unify that tone. While it doesn't aim for emotional depth in the same way as the top entries on this list, it achieves its intended purpose almost perfectly, making it one of the most consistently entertaining films in the entire lineup. Bride of Frankenstein is a more ambitious and stylistically expressive sequel that expands on the original's ideas, but it does so with a different approach that introduces both strengths and weaknesses. The film explores themes of loneliness, rejection, and the desire for companionship. And Boris Karloff's performance as the monster becomes even more emotionally expressive here, particularly in scenes like in his encounter with the blind man. Visually and tonally, the film is more stylized, incorporating elements of dark humor and heightened expressionism, which gives it a unique identity. James Whale's direction is confident and creative, and the film is filled with memorable imagery and ideas that have become iconic. However, this same ambition leads to some tonal inconsistency. The shifts between horror and satire and stylization can create a sense of fragmentation, making the film less cohesive as a pure horror experience. The most significant issue is the very late introduction of the bride herself. Because she appears so close to the end, there's very little time to build emotional investment in that relationship with her and the monster, which weakens the impact of the climax. Despite these issues, the film remains highly engaging and artistically impressive, but it falls just short of the top two spots due to those structural and tonal limitations. Frankenstein is one of the most foundational horror films ever made. And what makes it endure is how clearly it functions as both a horror story and a moral warning. At its core, the film is about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Dr. Frankenstein's obsession with creating life ultimately leads to consequences he cannot control. That theme is embedded directly into the narrative, which gives the film a strong sense of purpose and cohesion. Boris Karloff's performance as the monster is central to the film's emotional impact. He brings a sense of innocence and confusion to the character that makes the tragedy land, especially in moments like the scene with the little girl that we all know and remember. The film maintains a consistent tone of dread and inevitability, never straying too far into abstraction or tonal shifts, which helps it feel focused and grounded. One of the strengths is its efficiency. There's very little filler here, and the story moves at a steady pace toward its conclusion. However, some of the supporting characters are less developed, and one could potentially feel some of the early sound era stiffness in certain scenes. Although these aren't issues for me, these are issues that I would accept if one presented them to me. Even with those limitations, the film succeeds because it delivers a complete and coherent story with a strong thematic core, making it one of the purest examples of horror functioning as both a narrative and a cautionary tale. The Wolfman stands as the most complete and emotionally effective film in the Universal Monsters lineup because it fully commits to being a tragic horror story and executes that vision with consistency from beginning to end. The film follows Larry Talbot, a man who becomes cursed with lycanthropy, and what makes it so effective is how clearly and steadily his arc unfolds. From curiosity to denial to fear and ultimately acceptance of his fate. Every step of his journey is emotionally grounded and easy to follow. Lon Chaney Jr. brings a real sense of humanity to the role and makes Larry feel like a fully realized character rather than just a victim of circumstance. One of the film's greatest strengths is its tonal consistency. It never shifts away from its core identity as a tragic horror film, and the score, which is brilliant, plays a major role in maintaining that tone, reinforcing both dread and the emotional weight of Larry's situation. The pacing also strong with no wasted scenes. Everything contributes to the progression of the story. If there's any limitations, it's that the structure is straightforward and not particularly complex, but that simplicity actually works in its favor. The film achieves exactly what it sets out to do. And because of that clarity and emotional impact, it remains one of the most rewatchable and effective entries in the entire Universal catalog. All right, guys, so that is my ranking of all of the Universal Classic monster films. Hope you enjoy this video. If you dare, let me know your ranking of all these movies in the comment section. What's your favorite? What's your least favorite? Which series is your favorite? Anything you wanna you wanna let me know, leave it in the comment section. Hope you guys enjoy this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And until next time, you freaks, kick it and rock on.